Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are continuing to read Evicted by Matthew Desmond. We are currently on chapter 15, which is entitled A Nuisance, and we are almost done with part 2 of this book. Okay, so let's continue. The day after Crystal and Arlene's argument, Trisha came downstairs from her apartment after Chris had gone to work with Quentin. Trisha liked Crystal. She was much more youthful and silly than Arlene. That morning, the two women passed the time fooling around and playing patty cake. Their palms slapped together as they sang, "Shame, shame, shame. I don't want to go to Mexico. No more, no more, no more. There's a big fat policeman at my door, my door, my door. He grabbed me by my collar. He made me pay a dime. I don't want to go to Mexico. No more, more, more." Arlene watched unamused. She was reviewing apartment listings and making notes on a notepad with house written in black letters at the top. She regretted not going to a shelter after eviction court, but she hated shelters. Mostly she hated the other residents. Collecting her papers, Arlene nodded at Crystal and left to find a new place to live. Arlene was able to call on 24 places before heading back to 13th Street. She had no leads but was undefeated. Quote, "If I keep being persistent, I'll find me a house," end quote, she told herself. She also believed that Sharina had dismissed her eviction. She had not. When Arlene came back, the apartment was quiet, and Crystal looked troubled. After Chris had gotten home from work and Trisha went back upstairs, Crystal had heard him yelling at her for smoking his cigarettes and drinking his beer. She had heard other noises too. Quote, "The lady upstairs getting beat," end quote, Crystal told Arlene. Quote, "Who cares? I don't," end quote, Arlene answered. She had painful menstrual cramps and just wanted to lie down. Quote, "I kind of figured that was going to happen when he got here," end quote. Arlene didn't feel she had enough space in her head or her heart to consider Trisha's problems. Her own problems were enough. After night fell, more sounds came through the ceiling. There were blunt and muffled thuds, intersped with loud pounds when Trisha slammed into the floor. Arlene covered her head with the pillow, but Crystal stewed. Quote, "I ain't fixing to see no woman get beat up by no man," end quote, she said. She wanted to help Trisha, but she also couldn't help feeling repulsed by her weakness. She pitied Trisha and found her pathetic. Quote, If a man hits you like that and you let him back in, you like it," end quote, Crystal mused. At one point she had enough. Crystal climbed the steps to the upper unit and yelled through the locked door, quote, "I'm gonna dot your eyes, you scary hoe. And I want Chris to hear me too, because I dare him to put his hands on me," end quote. Arlene had to pull Crystal back downstairs. Crystal called Sharina, who didn't answer. Then she called 911 3 separate times. The police finally showed up and took Chris away. When they left, Arlene looked at Crystal. Quote, "You must want to lose your house," end quote, she said. The next day, the police called Sharina. The officer, a woman, sounded stern, but Sharina had been through this before. Last year, she had received a letter from the Milwaukee Police Department regarding the same apartment on 13th Street. Quote, "Pursuant to Section 8010 Milwaukee Code of Ordinances, MCO," end quote, the letter began. Quote, "I'm informing you that the Milwaukee Police Department has responded to nuisance activity at your property on at least 3 occasions within the 30-day period," end quote. It then listed the nuisance activities, which included a fight and a woman being sliced with a razor blade. The letter went on to inform Sharina that she would be, quote, "subject to a special charge for any future enforcement calls for any of the listed violations," end quote, that occurred at her property. The city had itemized all police services down to $4 per 911 call. Sharina was to respond in writing with the plan to, quote, "abate the nuisance activities," end quote, occurring at her property. Should those activities continue, the letter concluded, she could be subject to a fine between $1,000 and $5,000 or thrown in jail. Sharina wrote back to the Milwaukee PD, explaining that the 911 calls that had generated the letter were attributed to a domestic violence situation. Quote, "If these problems continue," end quote, she wrote, quote, "I will ask her to vacate the premises," end quote. When the district captain read Sharina's reply, he underlined the word, quote, ask, end quote, and drew a question mark in the margin, end quote. Excuse me, quote, not accepted, end quote, he scribbled on her reply. After she was notified that her abatement plan was rejected, Sharina stapled a copy of an eviction notice to her next letter to the police. The district captain wrote back, quote, this notice serves to inform you that your written course of action is accepted, end quote. Now 13th Street was a nuisance again, with issues upstairs and down. Most of Crystal's 911 calls were on Trisha's behalf, but once she had also called after getting into a roaring argument with Arlene. The police officer on the phone was asking Sharina to explain why her former and current tenants were living together. Sharina told the officer how Crystal and Arlene had met. When the officer asked Sharina why she had allowed such an arrangement, Sharina replied by saying that she had felt sorry for Arlene. Quote, but neither of them have a pot to piss in, end quote, she said. Quote, and they don't have a window to dash it out of, end quote. The officer laughed. Quote, she did wrong for trying to quote, she did wrong for trying to sublease my place, end quote, Sharina said. Quote, you know, Crystal doesn't quite understand that it's her place, but it's not her place, end quote. The call had embarrassed Sharina. Quote, I'm steady trying to work with these low-quality people, end quote, she said after hanging up. She had been content to, quote, turn a blind eye to Arlene still being there, end quote, but now the police were involved. The officer advised Sharina to toss them both out. Sharina decided to start with Arlene. She called her and began yelling into the phone. Quote, I'm sick of the bullshit, end quote, Sharina said. Quote, sick of this motherfucking shit. Tired of you throwing your fucking weight around when you're the one who owes. When your kids didn't have nothing to eat, who was it that went to the church and got a big box of food, milk, and stuff like that for them when you first got there? Who had spent her money and she didn't ask for it back? And you know, hello? Hello? End quote. And then that brings us to a changing of the theme within this chapter. And what stands out to me is the word low quality people. I think that really sort of articulates the way that Sharina views her tenants. And from what we've seen so far throughout this book, the way that a lot of landlords view the tenants that they have living in their properties, specifically when they're in low-income neighborhoods. And just again, we see the delayed response from the police department. We see how the police department's response is like they're basically responding they're agitated that they have to keep coming and dealing with issues at this place. When she said that she would ask for the tenant to move out, they said that wasn't good enough. She needs to force them out. So they didn't say that in so many words, but then she put an eviction letter on her course of action and it was approved. And so we just see how at all these different layers, people who are already vulnerable and already exploited and already oppressed have it compounded by these different institutions. And it's just a reminder of why this system is not one that's conducive to humanity. Let's keep reading. The police had called Sharina on a Saturday. She had told Arlene to be out by Monday. Sunday morning found Arlene sweeping the carpet as Trisha looked on. On the kitchen counter, cornbread was still caked in the pan, the brown edges giving way to spongy yellow middle. The night before, Arlene had made muffins too, and boiled pinto beans and neck bones. Her brothers had come over to eat, smoke, and throw spades upstairs at Trisha's. They drank, but knew not to offer Arlene a cup. She almost never drank alcohol, didn't like the feeling. Quote, thing I hate about Milwaukee, end quote, Arlene said, quote, is that the rent is so high, end quote. Quote, high, end quote, Trisha agreed, clicking her tongue. Quote, I pay upstairs $454 for a one-bedroom, end quote. The house was quiet with Crystal and Jory at church. Jory had gone with his dad. Jafar sat silently on the floor, coloring. Arlene tried to calculate how much time she had. If Sharina served the writ the next day, quote, That's still another 5 days to get my stuff out of here before the sheriff come, end quote. Trisha nodded. Arlene sat down at the table and looked at Jafar's while talking to Trisha. Quote, we in this house, so I didn't think about moving. I didn't have to think about my kids changing schools. I didn't have to think about none of that. No sense in crying, end quote, she said, straightening up. Quote, I might as well wipe my tears and do what I got to do, end quote. She called Sharina. Arlene started and stopped. Her words caught at the bottom of her throat, but she managed to ask Sharina if she could stay until Thursday. Sharina said no, and Arlene protested. Quote, that's Crystal. Ain't no police been called size Chris beating up Trisha. It's been her, end quote. In the last decades of the 20th century, as the justice system was adopting a set of abrasive policies that would swell police forces and fuel the prison boom, it was also leaving more and more policing responsibilities to citizens without a badge and a gun. What about the pawn shop owner who sold the gun? Isn't he partially responsible for the homicide? Or the absentee landlord who failed to screen his tenants? Didn't he play a role in creating the drug house? The police and courts increasingly answered yes. It was in this context that the Nuisance Property Ordinance was born, allowing police departments to penalize landlords for the behavior of their tenants. Most properties were designated, quote, nuisances, end quote, because of an excessive number of 911 calls that were made within a certain time frame. In Milwaukee, the threshold was 3 or more calls within a 30-day period. The ordinances pushed property owners to, quote, abate the nuisance, end quote, or face fines, license revocation, property forfeiture, or even incarceration. Proponents argued that these new laws would save money and conserve valuable resources by enabling police departments to direct manpower to high-priority crimes. In 2008 and 2009, the Milwaukee PD issued a nuisance property citation to residential property owners every 33 hours. The most popular nuisance activity was, quote, trouble with subjects, end quote, a catch-all designation applied to a wide variety of incidents, including people refusing to leave a residence and loud arguments. Noise complaints came second. The third most common nuisance activity was domestic violence. The number of domestic violence incidents, most of which involved physical abuse or a weapon, exceeded the total number of all other kinds of assaults, disorderly conduct charges, and drug-related crimes combined. One incident involved a woman having bleach thrown in her face. In another, a woman was, quote, hit on the head with a can of food, end quote. 2 involved the battering of pregnant women. Box cutters, knives, and guns were used. In one incident, quote, the caller stated that her boyfriend just sprayed her with lighter fluid and also set a piece of paper on fire, end quote. Most nuisance citations were addressed to properties on the north side. In white neighborhoods, only 1 in 41 properties that could have received a nuisance citation actually did receive one. In black neighborhoods, 1 in 16 eligible properties received a citation. A woman reporting domestic violence was far more likely to land her landlord a nuisance citation if she lived in the inner city. In the vast majority of cases, 83%, landlords who received a nuisance citation for domestic violence responded by either evicting the tenants or by threatening to evict them for future police calls. Sometimes, this meant evicting a couple, but most of the time, landlords evicted women abused by men who did not live with them. One landlord wrote to the Milwaukee PD, quote, this is one girl in one apartment who is having trouble with her boyfriend. She was a good tenant for a long time, until her boyfriend came around. Probably things are not going to change, so enclosed, please find a copy of a notice terminating her tenancy served today, end quote. Another wrote, quote, I discussed the report with my tenant. Her boyfriend had threatened her with bodily harm and was the reason for the 911 call. We agreed that he would not be allowed in the building and she would be responsible for any damage to the building property and evicted if he returned to the property, end quote. Another wrote, quote, first we are evicting Sheila M., the caller for help from police. She has been beaten by her, quote, man, end quote, who kicks in doors and goes to jail for 1 or 2 days. Catch and release does not work. We suggested she obtain a gun and kill him in self-defense, but evidently she hasn't. Therefore, we are evicting her, end quote. Each of these landlords received the same form letter from the Milwaukee PD. Quote, this notice serves to inform you that your written course of action is accepted. End quote. The year the police called Sharina, Wisconsin saw more than one victim per week murdered by a current or former romantic partner or relative. After the numbers were released, Milwaukee's chief of police appeared on the local news and puzzled over the fact that many victims had never contacted the police for help. A nightly news reporter summed up the chief's views. Quote, he believes that if police were contacted more often, that victims would have the tools to prevent fatal situations from occurring in the future. End quote. What the chief failed to realize, or failed to reveal, was that his department's own rules presented battered women with the devil's bargain. Keep quiet and face abuse, or call the police and face eviction. And that brings us to a changing of the theme within this chapter. So let's have a short review. So what we see again is just the lack of care that is at play in these systems when it comes to the peoples at the margins of our society, the people that's the most vulnerable in our society. And one of the things was pointed out here, you heard this police chief speaking as if he wants to do more for women who are being killed by their partners, as if he wants to do more to curb domestic violence. And that may be what he's saying on press conferences, but the procedures and the policies which are enacted by his police officers are ones that do not curb this type of violence, but instead perpetuates this violence and continues this violence for happening. And not even that, it is penalizing the victims of the violence, even going as far as penalizing people who are trying to help the victims of the violence, even going as far as penalizing people who own the property in which this violence is occurring in. And because they don't want to be penalized or persecuted, they're shifting that onus back onto the victim. And again, it just goes to understanding why so many people don't report these things, why these things continue to happen and continue to be perpetuating. And far too often, we don't have the information at our disposal to articulate to people why these things continue to happen, and to articulate to people how the institution of policing is not something that is set up to prevent these things from happening, as opposed to being set up to be able to profit off of these things happening. Let's continue reading. Crystal blew through the door along with the cold air, and the house tightened up. Church had taken a lot out of her, and her, quote, stomach was touching her back, end quote, as the saying went. She poured herself a bowl of Cap'n Crunch and planted herself on the love seat. She was wearing a black and gold silk blouse, a calf-length skirt, and a red head wrap. Crystal was aware of Arlene's situation, having returned Sharina's call on her bus ride home. Sharina had given some ground. Arlene could stay until Thursday if Crystal agreed to move into one of Sharina's other properties. If Crystal said no, Arlene had to be out the next day. Her cereal gone, Crystal was still hungry. She put some of Arlene's biscuits in the oven. Quote, you want some of these, baby? End quote, she asked Jafaris. Quote, he don't want none of that, end quote, Arlene snapped. Quote, you can't get mad at me. You can take it out on Sharina, end quote. Quote, I'm pissed off at you and I'm pissed off at Sharina, end quote. Quote, I have no control over what my landlords say, end quote, Crystal interrupted, pleading. Quote, I told y'all you could stay until February because that's what you paid me for. But Sharina said that you got to go. I have no say so over that because I'm not fitting to be out on the street because somebody gave me $150, end quote. Crystal breathed in deep and continued. Quote, I'm not finna get irritated. I'm not finna get agitated. I'm not finna get frustrated. I'm not finna call mama and tell her I ain't got no peace because I got peace right now. And I'm keeping it. I'm keeping it. I'm keeping it. End quote. Quote, you got peace and me and my kids got to go. End quote. Crystal bit her lip and looked to the ceiling. Quote, I can be out tomorrow. It don't matter. You can put my biscuits back in the refrigerator where you got them from. End quote. Arlene was yelling now. Quote, which day did you say you want Arlene out? Monday? You said Monday? End quote. Crystal shook her head and called Sharina. Arlene began pacing around, talking to the room. Quote, I really truly hate that I got into this situation. That's bogus. That is bogus as ever. I swear to God, this is bogus, end quote. Quote, I called the police, end quote, Crystal was telling Sharina. Quote, Chris and them was making a lot of noise upstairs and he was up there beating on that girl, end quote. Arlene asked for the phone and Crystal ignored her. Arlene began to shake. Quote, now look, now my kid's homeless. Nowhere to go and ain't got no money. Fuck me and my kids. Just fuck it. Fuck it, end quote. Crystal had never seen Arlene like this, so unraveled. She handed her the phone. Quote, I mean, end quote, Arlene said to Sharina, quote, they just throw me and my kids out on the street after I got my money, after we ain't got nothing no more. It was okay that we was here up until last time when the police got called. All I can say is thank you for what you done for me and my kids. Before Thursday, me and my kids will be gone. That's my promise. I can't give you nothing else, end quote. Arlene listened for a few seconds before shutting the phone while Sharina was mid-sentence. Quote, I feel that we getting used. Me and my kids getting used, end quote. She looked at Crystal, who that morning carried an old and calm spirit. Quote, I'm frustrated, end quote. She apologized. Quote, if I took my anger out on you, I'm pissed. Arrangements was made, end quote. She slapped her palm with the back of her hand. Quote, but the reason I know what you feel is that my family did this to me. The issues you got, can't nobody fix them but God, end quote. Quote, I don't have nothing but a trust issue, and I'ma always have a trust issue, end quote. Arlene sat down. Quote, but you shouldn't speak that over yourself, because everybody's not out to get you, end quote. Quote, everybody they is, though. You don't know what it's like. You don't know what I've been through. You don't know what it's like to have your father molest you and your mother not care about it, end quote. It was her stepfather, the minister. She was 10 when it started and 16 when it stopped. Quote, oh, yes, I do, end quote, Crystal said. Quote, yes, I do. I know exactly what that's like because my stepfather molested me when I was just a little girl, and that's why they sent me to foster care. I swear to God, I know exactly what you've been through. I swear to God, end quote. Arlene took it in. Jory had led Jafaris into their bedroom and turned on some music, which drifted into the living room as the women let out a moment of shared comprehension, passed in silence. Each knew something of the other's pain. The boys were sitting on a mattress, playing with Little. Arlene dropped her head, saying, quote, I'm sick of getting hurt, end quote. Quote, okay, you know what, end quote, Crystal said. Quote, I remember this like it was yesterday. I had been going to church for a month or so when the Spirit moved on me, and I told God, I'm tired of hurting. I'm tired of crying. I'm tired of suffering. I'm tired of people hurting me. But it's just to build and make you. Because me being hurt, me being lied on, me being talked about, me being abused, everything. Me being in foster care, me not having no mama, me not having no daddy, siblings don't care, aunties don't care, uncles don't care. Made me. If you want me to love you, how can I love you if you don't trust me? How can I comfort you? Can't nobody help you unless you allow them to do it. You've been molested? I've been molested too. At 10, I had a flashback, and I was 5 years old. I looked at my mother, and my mother was still doing drugs. My mother stayed with this man. My mom did the crack pipe. She was pregnant with me. My dad beat my mom, and my mom got stabbed in her back 11 times. So I know God got a calling on my life, but if I don't allow him to use me to do that calling, how can he do it? Church was awesome. I could see the Spirit of God. I could feel the Spirit of God. I know the Spirit moving in church because it'd be real smoky. And people might think I'm crazy for believing like that, but I mean, that's how I believe. My pastor treats me more like a daughter than my mother. I can say that much. And once again, I can't say how you feel because you don't have a mother. But once again, I can. Everybody goes through stuff in life, and you're going to continue to go through. Your situation is to make you. It's to build you. I went through it all summer. All summer. Felt like I didn't have nobody. Was ready to do crack this summer. But I prayed a prayer that my pastor prayed over me 2 years ago, and I firmly stand on that word and believe in it. I didn't even tell my pastor that my mama did crack at this time. And my pastor walked in the aisles, laid her hands on me and said, "Mama did crack, you ain't gonna do crack." All I could do was cry. End quote. Crystal's last word lingered in the air until it dissolved in the chattering of the television. Eileen sat there, stunned. Her phone rang and snapped her back. A friend had a lead on an apartment. Quote, "Does he do background checks and stuff?" End quote. Quote, "Come here." End quote, Crystal said once Eileen was off the phone. Eileen obeyed and Crystal held her. Quote, "What's the rent at that place?" End quote. Quote, "You know what? I didn't even ask him." End quote. Eileen called back and learned it was $600 a month and hung up. Quote, "Nope." End quote. Crystal left to inspect Sharina's other apartment. Quote, "It's going to be all right." End quote, she told Eileen. Quote, "If I can't promise you nothing else, it'll be all right. That much I can say." End quote. And that brings us to the end of chapter 15 and the beginning of chapter 16, which is entitled Ashes on Snow. And that will be our last chapter before we begin the final part of the book, part 3, which is entitled After. And I think we'll leave. I think that those last paragraphs were powerful, so we'll just leave it on that note. And we will be back tomorrow to continue reading Evicted by Matthew Desmond. Please share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on. Remember, we put these episodes out on a daily basis to provide people the opportunity to begin or further their journey in the struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. All right, I'm going to holler at you tomorrow.